So, Jurassic Park was my favorite book slash movie slash everything growing up. The book was published in 1990 when I was 8 years old, but you can bet I read that sucker from cover to cover till the movie came out in 1993. I was your typical late 80s, early 90s dinosaur nerd and loved science fiction. Even in my professional life today, I'm reading science textbooks almost daily to keep up with biology, chemistry, and physics classes I teach on the high school level. The book just seemed written for me, and I lapped it up. My mother, noticing my interests and always supportive of my reading, immediately went hunting for more Micheal Crichton books. I'm not exactly sure when I read Sphere for the first time. I know I did because rereading it recently, there were definitely elements of the book that I remember vividly. I also remember seeing the movie adaptation, which came out in 1998 to underwhelming acclaim. I did not intend to talk specifically about the film, although I may mention it and why I feel like a film adaptation of this book would be very difficult to pull off. Largely, though, the book just did not click with me like other Crichton books that I read in my youth. Congo, Jurassic Park, The Lost World have largely stayed vivid in my mind over the years. Rereading this book now, I can honestly say why, even as a bright tween and teenager, I was not ready to appreciate this book for what it is. Recently, as my 2-year-old had borrowed my phone, I was hunting for something to read during a rare break in work. I walked by the bookshelf and studied it quickly. I had picked up a copy of Sphere recently for $1 at the local book swap in my small hometown and pulled it down off the shelf. The yellowed old pages were inviting, and I thought, what the heck? Immediately, I was pulled into the book and finished the entire novel in a single day. The book grabbed my attention. It would not let go for the duration. Even more impressive, though, is how even after finishing it, I cannot stop really thinking about it. How am I still asking questions about it even days later? Still processing my thoughts upon completion of the book, I decided to do some research online, get some behind-the-scenes tidbits, and maybe read some other reviews of the book. On Goodreads.com, I found the book is favorably remembered by many, although the consensus is the book is somewhere just under a solid 4 out of 5, according to 181,000 readers on their website. Most of the criticism leveled to the book seems to revolve around the latter third of its pages and the escalation of some sexist and possibly even racist views put forth in the narrative at around that point. It is true that some of these ideas presented made me uncomfortable as a reader, but I don't think they are put in the novel because Crichton is a bigot. Quite the opposite, in fact. But I think I might be getting ahead of myself. Let's rewind a bit and explain some themes at play in the novel. The inspiration for the book is the idea that encountering extraterrestrial life that is fundamentally and completely different from us, and to explore the thesis that we would be completely unable to understand it, much less interact with it in a productive way. In that sense, the book is similar to Solaris, written in 1961 by Polish author Stanislaw Lem. Though in Lem's take on the alien, it is a sea on a planet, whereas in Crichton's book, it's a sphere under the sea. The book is also centered in a modern setting. How would modern man handle an encounter with an extraterrestrial phenomenon, or modern man from the late 1980s? In Crichton's familiar academic approach, he explains the theme to the reader directly through academic dialogue between a group of scientists debating the implications of the novel's themes. Very early in the novel, our protagonist Norman Johnson is called in for what he thinks is his expertise in handling trauma associated with survivors of plane crashes. It turns out the Navy actually wants him as an expert due to his involvement in writing of a report related to first contact with aliens. He reveals through internal dialogue that while he did not take the request for the report all too seriously, he did do his due diligence to research the topic. He performed a battery of psychological tests on pressure exerted in small groups in isolation. So in one sense, while he does not take the question of extraterrestrial life all that seriously, he does in the novel at least take his job pretty seriously. This is contrasted in the film where he admits that he just picked names of people he knew. Here he knows them because he researched them and decided they would be able to handle the pressure. This Norman is set up as a credible, academic, and empathetic person, in contrast to the character of the film. Both Normans come to the same conclusion to a central question they were given in the report. How would humans respond to the discovery of such an incomprehensible and unknowable entity? The answer given based on Norman's research, or both Norman's research in this case, is absolute terror. Norman arrives on the research vessel and quickly realizes he's not there to counsel plane crash survivors. The Navy has stumbled on a 300-year-old ship in the ocean that may or may not be extraterrestrial in origin. From the outset, most people see the ship's explanation as it has to be alien. It's too big to be anything else. This is the opinion of biochemist Beth Halpern and Ted Fielding, an astrophysicist. Both are excited by the potential scientific discoveries that may come from the wreck, but mathematician Harry Adams is immediately skeptical, but does not share his reasoning until his reasoning is confirmed later in the novel. What he does do is call out the mission commander, Harold Barnes, for withholding information from them, and is the first to cast doubt on Barnes for not being completely forthcoming with them. The team has one additional member that was not selected by Norman in his reports, an Arthur Levine, who's a marine biologist. Norman gives some insight into this oversight of his perspective. He did not include a marine biologist because he assumed first contact would be on land. However, to the point, more than 70% of the Earth's surface is water, so in his mind this was an oversight. Levine does not make it to the sublab anyway due to his innate claustrophobia. I read some reviews calling this a MacGuffin in the sense that the one expert needed to put them on the right trail early on, pointing out the unusual sea life, is conveniently not present for the trip. And while I agree that it is inconvenient for the characters that he doesn't come along, the purpose of this character, indeed this character moment, is to serve as a prop to point out Norman's trustworthiness at selecting candidates for this type of mission. Levine is the only member of the team Norman did not pick, and Norman selected people he believed could handle the pressure. This is a valuable piece of information that is shown to us subtly rather than told to us, shown, not told. It gives Norman's position as a narrator credibility that will be needed later on in the story. Norman picked these people carefully in the book, unlike the film. He picked them because they were bright and, from his perspective, stable. Everything is fairly normal in the story for a while. They go down to the sublab, they get set up, but soon Harry is proven correct in his assumptions about the crash, and that the ship is not alien in origin. Indeed, the ship is from the future, and is an American vessel built 50 years into the future. Harry deduced this because of the intact nature of the ship. It could not have crashed here, it arrived here from the future, thus sustaining no damage. During these interactions, we get some interesting character moments that come into play with the psychology later in the book. Ted is eager to leave his mark and take credit for discoveries, much to the chagrin of all involved except Norman. Harry is incredibly competent and trustworthy despite his early interactions with several other members of the crew portraying him as cold. Barnes is a capable engineer in his own right, but is consistently out of his depth and struggles to maintain command among the civilians in his group, who aren't used to taking orders. Another interesting interaction with Barnes that will be important later is his admission in the sublab that women are better suited for subservice in every way, but that most of the top brass would never accept that truth. This implies, based on his selections and indeed his admission to the truth, that he's not sexist. He picked the people who were best for the job. Didn't matter if they were male or female. But later on in the story, when Beth continues to disobey his orders, she accuses him of having a sexist mentality because she's a woman. Not necessarily because it's true, but because she's very much used to it being true. All the characters are revealed to have little prejudices like this. Ted envies Harry's natural talent and youth. Norman feels insecure, being the only non-traditional scientist on the team. Harry and Beth clash with Ted, an older white male who seems more interested in his own legacy than working with the team. These tensions escalate to paranoia and worse when the titular sphere is discovered on the ship. The team's first interactions with the sphere are consistent with the theme. They do not understand what it even is. The book is marvelously ambiguous throughout, never committing to one idea, but postulating several as to the nature of the sphere. Is it alive? Is it a machine? Was it man-made? Is it even from our universe? We as a reader will never know because it's unknowable. At first the sphere is opened by accident, but eventually the brilliant Harry figures out how and enters the sphere all by himself. All of this occurs congruent with a storm that takes away the support craft above the waves, isolating the crew from the outside world. I read a review that called this another MacGuffin of unhappy coincidence for our protagonists. While I can see their point, especially since it's the same MacGuffin that leads to the evacuation of Jurassic Park in Crichton's Jurassic Park novel 2 years later, I can actually forgive this one a little more than in JP. The storm is teased right from the beginning of the novel, while it's pretty miraculous coincidence that the storm in JP happens the week that they have this inspection, or else lawyers. It does make sense to me that the American military would be willing to brave a storm to keep the Russians from possibly discovering the ship and its technology, especially in light of the Cold War tensions still around in 1987. It comes across as believable in spite of its convenient, in quotation marks, timing. But I'll come back to that later. Harry emerges from the sphere hours later and is disoriented and confused. He cannot or will not explain what happened in the sphere, but remarks that he feels different, even looks different, though Norman insists he looks normal. Look, this is a spoiler-heavy review, so if you have not read the book or want to stop here, you've been warned. Anyway, through a cavalcade of weird and escalating circumstances, slowly the crew is taken out by sea fauna. Things escalate when a giant squid attacks and kills most of the crew and cripples the sublab. In the midst of the turmoil, the crew encounters a mysterious code that they deduce is coming from the sphere, or something released from the sphere. Harry cracks the code, and they communicate with some sort of intelligence which names itself Jerry. The intelligence and the manifestations are revealed to be directly related, as if the consciousness can manifest its thoughts at will and seems to be toying with them like a child. But Norman, going over Harry's notes on the code based on suspicions of the intelligence's behavior, discovers that the real name of the voice on the screen is Harry. He postulates that Harry was given the power by the sphere to manifest his thoughts as reality, but not just his conscious ones. He explains to Beth that this power can manifest a person's fears or desires or even their unconscious thoughts. Around here is where it seems to me most people reading the book went from a 5 out of 5 to a 4 or much lower. The best part of the writing, for me, in this book, though, is Norman's narration of the events. Norman is set up as a level-headed, agreeable, and most of all, reliable narrator. But starting with the first opening of the sphere, even before Harry goes inside, Norman starts losing credibility as a narrator. He begins to forget things, or notice things being different from before. There are gaps in his memory. The first brought to the reader's attention is he does not remember eating the dessert while everyone else is watching the sphere. Sometimes he catches his lapse in judgment or knowledge and remarks on it. Other times he does not. But subtly, the reader begins to ask the question, what's wrong with Norman? We think, did he go into the sphere? Maybe earlier than Harry. Why would Norman leave that out? Does he not remember it? He remarks on the changing appearance of his peers and himself. He seems to get younger and then suddenly grow older. He describes Beth as growing more and more attractive to him. His wounds heal unusually fast. Beth starts to try to seduce him and then suddenly completely stops, her appearance changing along with her behavior. After Harry is rendered unconscious by Beth and Norman to control him, strange occurrences keep happening, and through his unreliable narration, our suspicion as a reader falls heavily on Norman. This growing unreliability of the narration is a brilliant storytelling device. It brings my mind back to stories like House of Leaves or even Final Fantasy VII. It clues into the reader subtly that something is wrong with our protagonist and that he's not aware of it, but we are. This dramatic irony is effective here because of the multiple explanations for it. Is Norman cracking? Is it the sphere? Indeed, the circumstances of being in the sublab alone would be enough to crack many people. but it is especially noticeable here because of Norman's established credibility. The film takes a completely different approach with all the characters, putting their flaws on full display and makes them seem unstable and untrustworthy from the start, but the novel can convey information more subtextually through Norman's unique perspective as a psychologist through inner dialogue. It subtly changes the message of the work in some ways. The book shows us how even well-adjusted people can be undone by their trauma when presented with such unknowable and uncontrollable power, which to me is more compelling than the movie's approach. At the climax, Beth shines a light on our suspicions, calling Norman out for going into the sphere. She points out all of our suspicions as a reader and seemingly confirms them before finally the truth is revealed. Norman has not been in the sphere, but Beth has. What I think most people miss about this reveal is that the explanation for Norman being unreliable shifts not from Norman, but to Beth and Harry. As far back as Harry's first trip into the sphere, Norman argues with Ted about the validity of his field and remarks that he can't believe Ted got to him. But Ted got to him because of the influence of Harry and Beth. They're both tired of Ted, and their frustration changes Norman. Consistently in the narrative, Norman has moments of intuition that he cannot fully comprehend. Even his checking of Harry's work with the code is tied to this suspicion that he can't explain. Curiously, Harry is unaware of the power that he wields, but unconsciously, he longs for recognition. So when Harry is sleeping, his unconscious self pushes Norman to the truth. When Norman confronts this dark Harry on the computer, its anger is stemmed from Norman being unable to appreciate its greatness. Harry begins to alter Norman's appearance after this point to reflect his thoughts on Norman. Beth similarly alters her own appearance as well, becoming more attractive to the two men on the mission whom she admires and finds reliable. Subconsciously, she begins to influence Norman, healing his wounds, making him younger, and at some points making herself more attractive to him. She does not do this consciously either. There is some deep psychology going on here in that the insecurities of those with the power are slowly changing not just the appearance, but also the thoughts, memories, and emotions of those around them. The more Harry thinks those around him are bigots, the more bigoted they become. And the same is true for Beth. The power is not limited to manifestations of physical phenomena. It can alter the mind, time, and memory. This is why Norman forgets eating the cake, because Beth in the future calls his actions into question, affecting his mind in the past. She reveals his middle name is Harrison, but the book shows no records of Norman's name being Harrison at all, and this is done several times. No middle initial is even shown. When she tries to pin Harry's attack on him, Norman is confused and cannot remember his own middle name. His middle name may not even be Harrison, but if Beth wills it so, it becomes so. This revelation reveals so much about all the events since the sphere. Would Barnes have normally gone out and fought with the squid head on? Or was he influenced subconsciously by Harry and Beth, or both? What really happened to Fletcher? All they found was a shoe and a streak of blood. No further explanation is given to her faith. What about Ted? Sure, Ted starts out eager, but was he really reckless enough to open that hatch? Or is that just how Harry and Beth see him, and therefore how he becomes? When Beth turns on Norman, she accuses him of the same masculine bigotry as others that have opposed her before. This is not a flaw in her character. It's a subconscious thought, given form and grown by the power. She's not unstable. She's made unstable by the influence of the power. She subconsciously thinks this way because of the wounds of her past, being abused by former male relationships that she's had, and her anxieties are made real by the power of the sphere. There are so many clues to this scattered throughout the narrative. Barnes becomes increasingly incompetent and less trustworthy throughout the story because that's how Harry and Beth both see him. The power they have been given is on a scale that even the reader struggles to understand, and that is the point. I think that's why so many people didn't really like this part of the book, is because if you're not fully aware of the power's grasp, so much of this just goes right under the radar. In light of all that Norman is left with, there's really only one action that he can take left. Take the power for himself. He escapes Beth miraculously, probably due to Beth's inner turmoil in killing him, and that turmoil keeps him alive. Again, the power at work. He goes to the sphere and figures out that to open the sphere, you just have to imagine an opening. It's a great test if you think about it. No one is able to use the power without the ability to imagine. Indeed, the last theme of the book is revealed. In the end, it's not math or biology or psychology that connects the humans to the inhuman sphere. It's the ability to imagine. Norman asks the voice in the sphere if he is God, but even with his newfound power, he cannot understand the sphere's answer. He only has one action left, escape, but the power of the sphere quickly corrupts him. Just like Beth and Harry, his mind turns them into monsters. Monsters that he hates, monsters that he says deserve to die. His own wound is magnified again. Their prejudices against him become real to him and to them. He proclaims on his way to the surface that they deserve to die. And this shocks his senses, and he turns back to save them. When he arrives, though, Beth suddenly does not want to be rescued. He remarks it's ironic, but the truth is his power is influencing her now. He thought she deserved to die, even just a moment, but now she believes it as well. This is made available to the reader as subtext again, but realistically is never picked up on by most of the characters involved. During the final ascent is another great example. Harry keeps saying they're not going to make it, but Norman keeps in his mind correcting him. We're going to make it. We're going to make it. The three survivors manage to escape to the surface. On the surface, in the decontamination tank, they talk about what to do. They prove that mankind was not fit to have such power. They were stable, well-adjusted individuals, but the power brought out the worst in them. The internal struggle of the human psyches were too uncontrollable to be given such power. They decide as a group to forget the power, give it back in a sense, and rewrite the events of the last few days to match their own new story. But Beth doubts this course of action. Should we forget? Is it right? They count to 3, and Norman no longer remembers things as they were. They were completely successful. Time, history, memory, everything had been rewritten by the power, and that same power takes away their ability to wield it. But the last words of the book imply that it is possible that all 3 of them did not give up the power and forget. Some final observations before we wrap up. The power's ability to alter space and time is truly difficult even for the reader to understand. It might be too ambitious for its own good. The final act of literally rewriting history, not just from their own perspective, but the entire crew of the ship, has massive implications, and if anything, made me want to go back through the later portions of the book and look for more times that the power did more than just make giant squids. For example, what if the storm was a manifestation? What about Beth's confidence in repairing the life support? Did the power enable her to do things she might not have been able to do before? How about Norman being able to figure out the sub's controls or sudden appearance of weapons that can damage the squid? Many more examples of luck that maybe they weren't luck. Maybe they were the power at work. Speaking about the squid, the parallels to Verne's 20,000 Leagues of the Sea are kind of brilliant. In the novel, Captain Nemo seeks ultimate knowledge of the sea, and the sphere in a way represents how unattainable ultimate knowledge really is. Of all the fates in the book, I found Ted's to be the saddest. Ted wanted above all else to be remembered, and when Norman pulls the picture out of his pocket in the end, and Ted's last few days have been completely rewritten to mean nothing in the grand scheme of things, it feels like a deep and tragic loss. The book is by far the most cerebral of Crichton's work. The sphere is truly unknowable, not only as an entity, but even as a narrative. Even writing this review, I am unsure which events, persons, creatures were altered by Beth, Harry, or even Norman. Did Norman really go inside the sphere not once, but twice? Did Ted or Barnes ever go in? Even the end, some of the crew is ambiguous. No more than a shoe and a bloodstain. In other books, these would be negative strikes against the narrative. But in this book, they are purposely placed. In the end of the book, In the end, the book may be too clever for its own good, and in some ways, it may not be clever enough. Sometimes things were so chaotic I could not tell who was thinking or speaking at any given moment, which character I was interacting with as a reader. Some of the science has also been updated or even expanded on since the book's publication, and sometimes I feel like the language and phrasing of certain interactions would not translate well to modern readers or audiences. It is wonderfully futuristic and dated all at the same time, and comes with all the strengths and weaknesses inherent in that kind of writing. I think the film fails because this is not a book that can be easily translated to film. And also the deaths are kind of lame in the film. So much is rushed through for the sake of runtime, and supremely valuable internal dialogue of Norman is completely lost. Even with a great cast, this material just sort of transcends what a film can accomplish. All in all, I rather like the book, here and now. I'm not sure that I could have truly appreciated it even a few years ago. However, in a post-COVID world, it was a fascinating read. The power of the sphere itself could almost be a metaphor for the social media age. We live in a world today where whether something is true about another person is secondary to the desire of the creator's heart. This leads to a world of paranoia and prejudices being placed on everyone. Pretty far-sighted, considering the internet was not really a thing yet when this book was written. We live in a world today where sticks and stones may be preferable to words. At one point, Norman quotes the Sermon on the Mount, directing readers to the teaching that if one has committed adultery in the heart, it's the same as committing the act itself. In this story, that perspective is taken to its fullest expression. Murder in the heart literally manifests as murder in life, through the terrible power given by the unknowable alien force. Humans are balanced by many different parts of their psyche, and the force that holds back the darker parts of who we are is often material manifestation, what we are willing to do. But what if an encounter with an alien removed that barrier? Who would be able to escape the fear that would ensue? Sphere argues, no one.